Right, Erev Tov, everybody. This is Parashat Pinchas, second to last of our um, Parashiot Shavua. Next week is Matot Maseh together. Even in a leap year, we read them together. And then we'll take our Devarim break. Hopefully, I don't know if everybody's getting our weekly emails, but those who are already saw this, and I'll mention it to everybody. Always happy to hear feedback and always happy to get suggestions either of people we've studied the Parsha through their writings already that you would love to repeat on a different book, or other teachers we haven't done yet that fit into the broad category of modern Parsha commentaries that we might explore for one of the Chumashim this coming year. Meanwhile, as has been the case all the way through with Rav Samit, the Hebrew version of this essay is exceedingly long, including a lot of long footnotes. And the English version that we're going to look at together is a good bit shorter and also reorganizes the sub-chapters or subsections of the essay a little bit. I don't think it's great significance, the reordering. Although I wonder what Rav Samit himself thought about it, since order and structure were so important to his mode of analysis. This, I thought, was the question at first didn't capture me, but as I read on, I became more intrigued by it, and by sort of where he takes us towards the answer. So let me share my screen and we'll begin. Okay. The title is, when did Moshe pass the mantle of leadership to Yehoshua? This is sort of feels almost more like the answer to a question that we'll see as we begin to take a look. So first is presentation of the problem. Quoting from our Parashah, the latter portion of it, and God said to Moshe, ascend this Mount Avarim and see the land that I have given to Bnei Israel. You shall see it, and then you too shall be gathered to your people, biblical language for death, as Aaron your brother was gathered. As you rebelled, as meaning insofar as or because you rebelled against my command in the wilderness of Tzin, when the nation quarreled to sanctify me with the water before their eyes. These were the waters of descent of Kadesh in the wilderness of Tzin. Okay, so this is in our parasha where God is telling Moshe, go up to Har Avarim, look at the land, you're going to see it, and then you're going to die, basically. And we get a little sort of explanation. Why is Moshe to die? Because of what happened with presumably the sin of hitting the rock there at Kadesh in the wilderness of Tzin. Among his questions on our parasha, Abarbanel asks, the ninth question. We know that Abarbanel at the beginning of a section will typically ask a whole host of questions. Double digits is not uncommon, and then attempt to analyze the passage, and in so doing, resolve the questions. So first starts with his litany of questions, and here's number 9. The ninth question concerns God telling Moshe, ascend this Mount Avarim and see that land, concluding with the words, and you too shall be gathered to your people as Aaron your brother was gathered. But Moshe did not die upon receiving this command. Aaron, upon being commanded to die, ascended the mountain and died. Likewise, Moshe in the Parsha of Ha'azinu, meaning when there he got commanded to ascend the mountain and die, he did so. But here, why does God command him to ascend Mount Avarim if the day of his death has not yet arrived? Right. So just noticing, again, the instruction here seems to be a command from God to Moshe in our parasha, ascend Mount Avarim, see the land that I have given to Bnei Israel. You will see it, and then you will die. You'll be gathered unto your people. And yet that doesn't happen here in Parashat Pinchas, when even though the comparison is to Aaron, and in Aaron's case, the command was immediately followed by the carrying out or the realization of that in Aaron's death, with Moshe, some time seems to pass in between. It doesn't happen right here in our Parsha. A great distance separates Parshat Pinchas, where we find ourselves, and the Parshiot of Ha'azinu and Vizot HaBracha, where Moshe is commanded once again to ascend Mount Avarim to die, and he does so. Admittedly, from a chronological point of view, the distance in time is not great, only a few months. But those final months of Moshe's life were full of momentous events, as attested to by the end of Sefer Bamidbar and all of Sefer Devarim, right? A lot of important stuff happens in Moshe's life in these final months, primarily his speeches, but there still are significant concluding experiences that he lives through. How does that all happen if he's being told in this week's Parsha, ascend to Mount Avarim, see the land, and then you'll be gathered unto your people? It's therefore impossible that at this very early stage, with many very important tasks still awaiting Moshe, that he would be told that his time has come to die before completing his life's mission. What then is the point of the verses quoted above? Okay, so what's our parsha actually expressing here when God says to Moshe, go climb Mount Avarim, see the land, and then you'll be gathered unto your people? That's the problem. Section A. Section B. No chronological order in the Torah, a phrase that we hear sometimes in Hebrew, ein mukdam umu'uchar b'Torah, a solution and its rejection. Not uncommon for Rav Salmon in the beginning to cite different answers and say why he doesn't find them to be, favorable or effective at answering the question. The great similarity between Bamidbar 27:12-14 and Devarim 32, 48-52 gives the impression that the Torah is describing the same command. Now, in the Hebrew, there's a lengthier analysis of the comparison, and it's worth taking a second to actually look at them side by side or close to side by side. Okay, so our psukim we saw already, but I'm going to lay them out in front of you again so that when I switch to the parallel passages in the end of Hazinu, you'll be able to see quite clearly how close they are. God said to Moshe, ascend the heights of Avarim and view the land that I've given to the Israelite people. When you have seen it, you'll be gathered to your kin just as your brother Aaron was. For in the wilderness of Tzin, when the community was contentious, you disobeyed my command to uphold my sanctity in their sight by means of the water. Those are the waters of Meribat Kadesh in the wilderness of Tzin. That's our parashah. Then we come to the end of Vizot HaBracha. That very day, God spoke to Moshe, ascend these heights of Avarim to Mount Nevo, which is in the land of Moab facing Yericho, and view the land of Canaan, which I am giving the Israelites as their holding. You will die on that mountain that you are about to ascend, and you shall be gathered to your kin, as your brother Aharon died on Mount Hor and was gathered to his kin. For you both broke faith with me among the Israelite people at the wilderness of Meribat Kadesh in the wilderness of the waters of Meribat Kadesh in the wilderness of Tzin, by failing to uphold my sanctity among the Israelite people. So the similarities are very striking. All we could say perhaps is that Devarim has extra phrases sprinkled in, but has almost entirely the same words included in it as we had here in Bamidbar in our parashah. So the parallels are very, very strong. Okay. So the great similarity gives the impression that the Torah is describing the same command. Go up on Mount Avarim, see the land, and then you will die. This would tempt us to answer that there's no chronological order in the Torah, and the command appears here before its designated time. However, this answer is impossible, as we shall see shortly. Yehoshua's appointment as Moshe's successor appears in our narrative as the crux of the story. Moshe requests that God appoint a man over the congregation who will go out before them and come before them, and makes no mention of any specific person. That's Moshe. Only in God's response to Moshe, introducing the second half of the story, do we find the big news. Take for yourself Yehoshua ben Nun, a man of spirit, and place your hand upon him. We may conclude that up until this point, it is not clear who will succeed Moshe in the leadership role. Okay, so the first thing Rav Salmon is saying to us is, okay, yes, those two sections, the three psukim in our parashah and the parallel psukim in the end of Dvarim and the end of Hazinu are parallel, but read on in our parashah, and where you find that right after God gives these instructions to Moshe, Moshe says, let God appoint someone over the community, etc., etc. And God answers, single out Yehoshua, lay your hand upon him, invest him with some of your authority, etc. He's going to be your successor. Now we ask, where in the Torah is there any clear indication by Moshe or by God of Yehoshua as the next leader of Israel? Such indications are found in several places in the Torah, starting in the final parshot of Sefer Bamidbar and continuing through Sefer Devarim. And we have a whole set of citations here. If the command to Moshe at the end of Parashat Ha'azinu to ascend Mount Abarim to die there, that's meaning the one at the end of Devarim, is the same command given in our Parashah, then it is that command that causes Moshe to ask God to appoint him a successor. And only then does God notify him that Yehoshua will be the next leader. But this does not sit well with all the sources in which we discern that Yehoshua was already recognized as Moshe's successor from the time of the events described at the end of Sefer Bamidbar, even before Moshe launches into his great and final speech. In other words, if we are meant to take the approach that the way of resolving the fact that the command to Moshe to go up to Har HaAvarim, see the land and die, which happens really in the end of Devarim, right before he dies, that's its real place, but it's just mentioned earlier here, but we have a big problem. Because right after Hashem tells Moshe that this is going to happen, Moshe asks for a successor. And that successor is obvious right now in our parasha and continues to be known, Yehoshua, for the rest of Bamidbar and all of Devarim. It doesn't come as a revelation in the actual moments before Moshe's death. It happens now in our parasha. So we can't say that God's instruction to Moshe to go up on the mountain and die really only happened at the end of Dvarim and is just being mentioned here for some reason, because it's actually here and now, months before Moshe's death, in real time here at the end of Bamidbar, that what follows on the heels of this command to go up on the mountain and see the land and die happens, which is that Moshe asks for a successor and is told that it's Yehoshua. We must therefore conclude that the command in our parasha is located in its proper chronological place. It really happens here that God tells Moshe to go up on the mountain and see the land and then die. Moshe's request that a successor be appointed and God's response, revealing Yehoshua as his successor, apparently took place after the census in the plains of Moab, chapter 26, and before the war against Midian, chapter 31. Indeed, nowhere prior to our narrative is there any mention of Yehoshua as Moshe's successor. Yehoshua is mentioned, of course, many prior occasions going all the way back to Shemot as Moshe's right-hand man, but not his successor. But if this is so, then not only Moshe's request for a successor appears in its proper place, but also the motive that leads him to request this. The command that he ascend Mount Avarim and die appears in its place and time, and not in accordance with the principle that there's no chronological order in the Torah. This brings us back to Abarbanel's question. But Moshe did not die upon receiving this command. Why does God command him if the day of his death has not yet arrived? Okay, so if we're convinced now that this instruction, parallel though it may be to the instruction in Devarim, is happening actually now, because it's what motivates Moshe, as evidenced by the fact that Moshe responds by asking for a successor, and that successor is appointed right now, months before Moshe's death. But what do we make of the fact that God seems to be telling Moshe right here and now, months before his actual death, to go up on the mountain, look at the land, and that then he will die? Ramban's solution: an event in the present that is entirely concerned with the future. Whether for the reasons above, or out of a fundamental objection to the principle of no chronological order in the Torah when not absolutely necessary. This is something we know about the Ramban. Rashi is more inclined to answer about certain things. There's, no before and after, no chronological order in the Torah, and Ramban is much more hesitant to use that only when he feels he has no other interpretive choice. The Ramban attempts to explain God's command to Moshe, as well as the continuation of the story, in keeping with the chronological context. The solution proposed by Ramban for our verses is that they were indeed told to Moshe here and now, at the time of the events narrated at the end of Sefer Bamidbar. However, they are not actually a command, for if they had been, Moshe would have been obliged to ascend Mount Avarim immediately. But rather, they are a notice concerning the future. Okay, so God is somehow telling Moshe, in the future, you're going to go up on Mount Avarim, see the land, and then you will die. Not that that's happening now, but in notifying him that this is going to come, Moshe, of course, says, okay, if I'm going to die, I need a successor. Or maybe we should say Moshe knew he was going to die at some point, presumably. If you're now actually informing me, God, that time is coming near, then I need to now make sure that there's a successor. Ramban's approach solves the difficulties mentioned previously. Without relying on the principle of no chronological order in the Torah, Ramban manages to relate God's words here to God's words at the end of Parshat Hazinu. They are indeed the same words, but they are uttered twice, at different times and for different purposes. In our parasha, they are only a notification as to the future, while at the end of Parshat Hazinu, they are uttered as a command that must be fulfilled immediately. Now, let me pause here and say for a moment, I think this is probably what I automatically assumed without having gone through all these machinations when I read this in our parasha, because I say, I know Moshe is not dying now. We know all these events are yet to come. It sounds like a command, but it can't really be a command, or not a command that Moshe is expected to fulfill immediately. It must be kind of a notification in command language. So that's what I would have assumed all along, but it's still important, to honor a close reading of the text, to ask the question. This is in command form, and yet it's not actually carried out now. Why is it here? And that's what the commentaries are doing. They're taking seriously the text as it appears, posing their questions, offering different answers, and here is the Ramban's answer. The indication of Yehoshua as Moshe's future successor similarly appears in our parasha as a notification about the future. From now on, Moshe and all of Israel know that Yehoshua will inherit Moshe's leadership position, even though the actual transfer of power will take place just before Moshe's death. This then is the reason that Yehoshua's appointment as Moshe's successor is a known fact, starting from the final parshiot of Sefer Bamidbar. Thus, Ramban maintains the dialogue between God and Moshe in our parasha takes place at the time of its location in the text, right? This is how it's actually happening. It follows the census described previously, but this dialogue in its entirety concerns the future. God's notification to Moshe that he will die on Mount Avarim, Moshe's request that a successor be appointed, and God's response, all of these pertain to the future when Moshe's day of death arrives. Why then, in Ramban's view, does this dialogue about the future take place at such an early stage? Ramban explains, since God commands him right before this, to these shall the land be divided, God notifies him, it will not be divided by you, for you will ascend Mount Avarim and die there, and will not get to the land, but only see it. So there's a contextual explanation. God is telling Moshe about how the land is going to be divided, thinks to God's self, maybe Moshe thinks that he's going to be the one who actually carries this out. Let me remind you now, or notify you now, Moshe, you're not going to be the one who carries this out. You will get to see the land, but you will not get to apportion the land or enter into the land. Ramban's explanation for the Torah dealing with the decree of death for Moshe in our narrative, such a long time before his actual day of death, does not solve the issue of why the Torah must also mention Yehoshua here, which, according to Ramban's own explanation, is also a matter that will become real only in the future. It appears that Ramban was not troubled by this question, because he maintained that the discussion regarding Yehoshua's appointment was a secondary result of the notice about Moshe's death in the future, rather than the whole reason for this parsha. Meaning, for the Ramban, it's because Moshe might think he's going into the land when he hears about the rules for apportionment of the land, that God has to tell him he's not going into the land. That's why it's important to mention that now. Then Moshe is prompted to ask about a successor, and God answers that question, but that's not actually essential for right now. It's impossible to me. It's quite striking when we think about the application of Parshat Shavua to current events and how it somehow always finds its way. I chose this essay before President Biden announced that he was not going to continue to re-election, so all the different themes that are emerging here certainly feel salient and resonant. I'll leave that at that for now, and we'll continue forward. Okay, this gives rise to another difficulty. The majority of our story, 9 out of 12 verses, and this is again a classic kind of Rav Samet structural analysis. Take the stories of the Torah, break them into units, look at what is the theme word or takes up the bulk of the space, and then kind of try to analyze everything once you've answered those questions. So Rav Samet looks at this section and says, what's it about? It's about Yehoshua's successorship of Moshe. That's what seems to drive this narrative. So we have to ask questions and analyze based on that. The majority of our story, 9 out of 12 verses, is devoted to the discussion of Yehoshua's succession. From the point of view of literary structure and the internal proportion between the various parts of the Parsha, we must deduce that the notice of Moshe's impending death appears to be the less central aspect of the story, right? Where we had just said that for the Ramban, it was the main aspect of the story, and Yeshua's successorship was secondary. It seems to appear here, right, the notice of Moshe's impending death, only as the pretext for Moshe's subsequent request that a successor be appointed. This is especially true if we accept, unlike the Ramban, that God's command to Moshe to appoint Yeshua and Moshe's fulfillment of this command pertain to the actual time when our story takes place, rather than to some time in the future. In other words, that it's actually happening in Moshe's finding out he's not going to go into the land. He asks for a successor, and God is telling him about the successor, not just so that he'll know about that for when it's time to do that later, but because something of that successorship is actually supposed to happen now. If that's the case, then the story must really, really be about the successorship, not about Moshe's notification or God's notification to Moshe about his death. Which then, again, heightens the question, what's that piece doing here? And what do we make of the successorship as the central theme to the story? Abarbanel's solution. The command that Moshe ascend Mount Abarim pertains to the present. Okay, this is going to be interesting. Abarbanel attempts to interpret the imperative style of God's words to Moshe in their literal sense, but not as an instruction to Moshe that he go to die upon Mount Abarim immediately. This is, I think, the most novel of the interpretations. Of course, Rav Samet will point out the problems with it, but it's a fascinating interpretation to consider. And now we understand a little bit more, as we're about to see it, what drives it from the perspective of what are the problems and challenges in the text. In this utterance, this is, again, the Abarbanel. In this utterance, although God commands him, that's Moshe, to ascend the mountain and see the land, it is not in order that he die there immediately. This command is not identical to the narrative at the end of Ha'azinu, and the action described there is not the same as the one described here, as Ramban thought. For this reason, it is not written here, and die upon the mountain, as it says there. Don't worry, we'll look at these side by side again in a moment. Rather, God commands that he ascend the mountain that is before them, that is, several times, and view the land from there. For whenever he ascends there, he will lift his eyes to the hills in order to see the land. Every day. We'll look at them side by side after we get a little further. Thus far, Abarbanel has interpreted verse 12. Ascend this Mount Avarim and see the land, which is literally a command and pertains to this moment in time. And as Abarbanel has indicated, continually. He now begins to address verse 13. You shall see it, and you too shall be gathered unto your people as Aaron your brother was gathered. How does the Abarbanel interpret that? When God says now, you shall see it, and you shall be gathered to your people, it is to teach that now Moshe will see the land himself as much as he is able to see, but he will see a different view of it again at the time of his death, as is mentioned there in Parshat Ha'azinu. This is the meaning of you shall see it in the future tense, as opposed to the imperative, re'eh, see it, in the previous verse, which refers to the present tense. The vav at the beginning of vira'ita changes the tense from past to future. Then you will be gathered to your people. At that time, after that final viewing, as Aaron your brother was gathered. Thus Moshe was not commanded that he would die right now, but rather was being told to ascend the mountain regularly and to view the land from there, for his death was not far away. God gives the reason for his being gathered to his people in the wilderness without entering the land by stating that it is in accordance with their sin. Okay, let's look at those psukim for a moment, and then we'll review with Rav Samet's review. Okay, so now we understand that what God was saying to Moshe was the following. Ascend, that's an imperative. Right now, go up to Har HaAvarim. Ura'eh, right now, see the land that I have given to the children of Israel. And in fact, in an ongoing way, you're going to regularly, now and in an ongoing way, go up on Mount Avarim and see the land. For the next while, you are going to continually, every day, go up on Har Avarim and look at the land. Go up on Har Avarim and look at the land. Then in the future, there's going to come a time. So the English translation here we have to throw out and interpret as Abarbanel wants us to interpret. And in the future, you will see it. And at that time, you will be gathered to your people, just like Aaron, your brother, was gathered. So go up every day on Har Avarim. This is verse 12. Go up every day on Har Avarim and look at the land. And then there's going to come a day when you go up in the future and you give it a different kind of look, a final look. And at that time, you will be gathered to your people like Aaron was gathered because of the sin which you did. Abarbanel interprets all the imperative expressions in our narrative as regular commands pertaining to the immediate situation. The imperatives, again, are verse 12. Go up and view. Only in verse 13, you shall see and you shall be gathered, you shall see the land and you shall be gathered to your people, is treated by him as notification about the future. The verbs in this verse do admittedly allow such an interpretation, for they are future tense verbs. The transition from verse 12, commanding Moshe to ascend Mount Avarim immediately, to verse 13, notifying him about the final viewing, following which he will be gathered to his people, is likewise exegetically reasonable. So this is Rav Samet saying, the Abarbanel, it's a defensible reading of the text, and he's noticed very well the shift between the commands and the descriptions of the future. But Abarbanel's interpretation is not altogether plausible from the thematic perspective. So before we reject it, I just want to say, what a fascinating thought that what God is telling Moshe is like, as your time to die draws near, I want you to go up every day or regularly on Har Havarim and look at the land. That's going to be like part of your parting experience. And then there's going to come a day a few months from now when you go up for a final look and you die. Could imagine it could be crushingly painful and difficult for Moshe, or that maybe there's something cathartic and moving about getting regular viewing visits to the land he's not going to get to enter. These sort of private moments of daily reflection overlooking the land of Canaan. I could totally imagine it either way. But Rav Samet's going to tell us it's not really a reasonable interpretation at all. But I'm glad that we got to see it because I think it's just so much to consider as a fascinating possibility. But Abarbanel's interpretation is not altogether plausible from the thematic perspective. The very idea that God is commanding Moshe to ascend Mount Avarim several times, for whenever he ascends there, he will lift his eyes to the hills in order to see the land every day, is a new idea that makes no sense. The command to Moshe to ascend Mount Avarim on the day of his death is a command with a purpose. This ascent is meant to make the moment of death easier for him to bear, because he will have feasted his eyes upon the promised land. Again, we could say the opposite, but on that reading, okay, he has his one opportunity. It softens the pain of the separation through getting a chance to see. A further difficulty, but all the other days, what's that doing? So again, I might suggest it's softening it even further with regular exposure, but Rav Samet doesn't accept that. A further difficulty that arises from Abarbanel's interpretation is that if God is commanding Moshe to ascend Mount Avarim now, where is this command fulfilled? The absence of any description of the fulfillment of the command to ascend Mount Avarim proves the Ramban's view, or one similar to it. He never says he actually did it, so how could it really be describing now as an actual command for now? As the Ramban notes, what Moshe is told in verse 12 is not a mitzvah that the Holy One commands him to fulfill right now, for if this were the case, he would be obliged to ascend immediately, and we certainly have no evidence that he did. Okay, a new suggestion. So again, we saw Ramban's idea that, first we saw the possibility that Ein Mukdamu Mu'achar B'Torah, that really this only ever happened in the end of Moshe's life, but it's mentioned earlier here. But that didn't really make any sense because it goes along with Moshe's request for a successor, which must have actually happened now because it's referenced for the rest of the time between now and Moshe's actual death a few months later and a book of the Torah later. Then we had Ramban's possibility that this is just a notification for the future. But if that's the case, then that would mean that Yehoshua's successorship is also just a notification for the future. But Yehoshua's successorship seems like a central dimension of this story. And so it would seem strange just to be brought up by now if it seems to actually be the heart of what this story is about. a new suggestion. Our discussion of the possibilities raised by the various commentators allows us now to propose an interpretation that will solve the difficulties we have encountered, while in turn creating new ones. Okay, Reb Samet acknowledges when you have a challenge, usually it's hard to solve all the issues with it in one, grand solution. I propose that God's words to Moshe in verses 12 to 14, ascend this Mount Abarim and see the land, be wholly identified with their parallel at the end of Parshat Ha'azinu, as the great similarity between the two sources would seem to suggest. Right? This being so, the appearance of this utterance by God in our Parsha is indeed an instance of there is no chronological order in the Torah, but the same is not true of the continuation of the story. In other words, those lines, go up to Mount Abarim, see the land, and you're going to die there, did not happen now. It actually happened in Ha'azinu, and it's just being put here as a placeholder. Why? We'll see. At the time where we find ourselves, in the middle of Parshat Pinchas, a few months prior to Moshe's death, these words are not told to Moshe. The words, go up on Mount Abarim, you'll see the land, and then you'll die. Neither as a command that must be fulfilled immediately, Abar Benel, nor as notification of what will occur in the future, Ramban. These words are destined to be said to Moshe only on the day of his death, as recorded at the end of Parshat Ha'azinu. But in Parshat Pinchas, the Torah gives us, I'm emphasizing the us, this preview, to fill a need not of Moshe's, but of ours, the readers. If anyone has anyone in their life to whom they read Piggy and Gerald books, kids' books by Mo Willems, the reader is like an important character in the book that they often talk about. Like, oh, look, it's our readers. So the awareness of the role of the reader is very important. So just as an aside, what makes this preview necessary? It is Moshe's request of God, let God appoint a man over the congregation, and the ensuing discussion. This request by Moshe comes in the midst of his routine activity as leader of the nation. Therefore, it would hit us like a bolt of lightning, without any psychological preparation on our part, and without any introduction in the text, were it not for the Torah's prior notification that the day of Moshe's death is drawing near. This also hints that Moshe himself is conscious of this fact. Again, holding current events in parallel as we read here. Right? So in other words, Moshe, in going about his business as leader of Bnei Israel, has some awareness that his time is drawing near to its end, and he turns to God and says, appoint a leader who will, who will go out before the nation and come in before the nation. And if we, the readers, just saw that, we would be flabbergasted. We'd be overwhelmed. Why? What's going to happen to Moshe? I mean, we know, but we can't really confront it. And just through Moshe just asking for a new leader. So we need to be brought into it by being reminded as readers that Moshe is going to die. From a thematic point of view, this interpretation is close to the Ramban's definition of the function of verses 12 to 14, as notification of what is destined for Moshe on the day of his death. The difference is that Ramban sees them as notification by God, as actually given to Moshe at this time, which forces him to interpret, the imperative form of God's commands as regular future tense. According to my suggestion, verses 12 to 14 should be regarded as notification by the Torah to the readers of the story. Taking the command in Ha'azinu and introducing it in our Parsha, relying on the principle that there is no chronological order in the Torah. It's just being the things God said to Moshe later are being popped in here for us, but God didn't actually say them to Moshe now. They're just like quoted here for us to read, to begin to prepare ourselves and understand why Moshe now asks God for a successor. If verses 12 to 14 are not God's actual speech to Moshe, notifying him of his impending death, what prompts Moshe to request that a successor be named? In general, we may answer that his motivation is his awareness that his death is drawing near and that he must take care of the issue of a successor. Moshe needs no reminder of this. He knows that the decree has been passed upon him. You shall not bring this congregation to the land I have given them, will be fulfilled. His brother has already died as a result of this decree just a short while ago, and the nation is already in the final stages of preparation for entering the land. If Moshe does not attend to the appointment of a successor now, when will he do it? But we, the readers of the Torah, need a reminder of that decree. Do we really? Okay, that's Rav Samet's argument. The multiplicity of events, of which Moshe is always at the center, may lead us to forget that Moshe's death is drawing near. We may therefore be taken by surprise by his request of God to appoint a successor when he is still functioning at full strength, fulfilling his role as leader with no signs of weakening. F. The census and Yoshua's appointment. This interpretation changes our perception of the crux of the story. Verses 12 to 14 can no longer be considered the main thrust of the story. They are merely a necessary technical / emotional, psychological introduction to assist us in understanding the rest. It is the continuation regarding the appointment of Yoshua that is therefore the essence of the story. The fact that these verses represent a technical introduction is borne out by the very fact that our parashah is not their proper place. They appear here only as a preview, right? You read them, and if you instinctively go through that internal process of saying, wait a minute, Moshe doesn't die here, so why are these here? They're just preparing us for what's coming. Because these words were not actually spoken by God to Moshe at this time, we need not ask why God chooses specifically this moment to notify Moshe of his impending death, because God isn't actually doing that. Likewise, there is no need to find any significance to the juxtaposition of the census or the discussion of the inheritance of the land to these verses, like the Ramban does in order to explain why it's here. Verses 12 to 14 are not related to what precedes them. Rather, they are a necessary preamble to what follows them. This, of course, reminds us just of that sort of general question. Sometimes when we read something and we're trying to make sense of it, we could look at what comes before, we can look at what comes after. What sort of is the tighter link or connection to explain its placement? The question we must ask is a different one. Why does Moshe ask of God to appoint a new leader specifically at this time? According to the literal text, it would seem that the motivation for his request right now is the preceding census. Okay, so we're now going back to Ramban's point, but saying it's not that God needs to tell Moshe of this now because of the census, but there's something about the census that motivates Moshe to ask God for the successor, not to focus on his death. Moshe knows that this was his census of farewell from the nation, and the population that he counted must now be entrusted to a new leader. This leads him to ask God to appoint such a person. The root pakad, pei kuf dalid, appears 20 times in chapter 26. Let us review the concluding verses of this census. Our psukim are in chapter 27, but we're now getting the background, the census that's in chapter 26. Let's review the concluding verses of this census, mifkad, together with Moshe's request and God's response to it. Chapter 26, verse 63. These are the people numbered, Pekudei, by Moshe and Elazar the Kohen, who counted Pakdu, Bnei Israel, in the plains of Moab at the Jordan near Yericho. But among these, there was not a single man of those counted, Pekudei, by Moshe and Aharon, which I guess should be, and Elazar the Kohen, who counted Pakdu, Bnei Israel, in the wilderness of Sinai. For God had told them, meaning there was nobody left who was counted in the previous census, when they had just exited Egypt. For God had told them, they will surely die in the wilderness, and not a single man remained of them, except for Caleb ben Yefuneh and Yehoshua ben Nun. That's the end of chapter 26. Now we come back to chapter 27. Moshe is told of his death, or not actually. The readers are told, are told anticipatorily the quote of the psukim where God tells Moshe he's going to die and to go up on Mount Avarim from the end of Dvarim. The readers are given that excerpt early here now. Then we're told that Moshe asks God for a successor, and God answers. Moshe asks, let God, Lord of the spirits of all flesh, appoint Yifkod. There's our same root from the end of from throughout chapter 26. A man over the congregation, that God's congregation not be like sheep that have no shepherd. And God said to Moshe, take for yourself Yehoshua ben Nun. The concluding verses of the census themselves, end of chapter 26, indicate that this is Moshe's farewell census. These verses contrast the two censuses that frame Sefer Bamidbar, the census conducted in the wilderness of Sinai in the 2nd year, and the present census conducted in the plains of Moab in the 40th year. The first census was conducted by Moshe and Aaron, the leaders of the generation that left Egypt. The present census is carried out by Moshe and Eleazar the Kohen. Those originally counted have all been replaced. Not a single man remained of them. Even Aaron himself has been replaced by his son Eleazar. Only Moshe remains as the tangible link between the two censuses. But it is nevertheless clear from this census that Moshe is not the natural leader of the new generation. Who then will be the leader of this generation? The answer is hinted at quite dramatically in the fact that the larger literary unit describing the census, 65 verses in length, concludes, surprisingly, with the name of Yehoshua bin Nun, seemingly quite unnecessarily. This conclusion hints that it is Yehoshua who will be entrusted with the leadership of these people. Let us now turn to Moshe's request of God, opening with the word yifkod, let God appoint. The meaning of the word here is appoint and not count, but it is certainly no coincidence that both the word pakad and the root mana are related both to leadership and to counting. It appears that there's a fundamental connection between these two actions. The leader is one who counts his nation. The mifaked, leader or commander, counts, poked. The mimuneh, appointed one, numbers, moneh. Likewise, Moshe's words further on, that God's congregation not be like sheep that have no shepherd, appear to have their source in the census that has just been completed. Counting the sheep is one of the regular tasks of the shepherd as he ends his day's work and returns the flock to the owner. Similarly, Moshe, the faithful shepherd, counts his flock before taking leave of them, and therefore he is concerned that that flock not be left without a shepherd. Following all of this, we come to God's response to Moshe, revealing the name of the next leader who will guide the flock, Yehoshua bin Nun, whose name concluded chapter 26, the chapter recounting the census of Bnei Israel. So really, in my mind, a robust and thoughtful analysis. Again, not necessarily a perfect answer, but as I feel, especially with Rav Meidan, even if the answer isn't perfect, we're sort of left appreciating the power of the question and asking ourselves, how exactly do we pull these, verses together? What's their central theme? What's the message? And we have 3 or 4 different approaches with their pros and cons pointed out to us. Okay, happy to take comments. Glad to see some hands. We'll go Bracha, Rav Scott, and then Dad. Go ahead.
So I guess I have a slightly different question, which is I was struck by the name, not that he's being told twice in terms of going up to the mountain facing his death, but that I was struck by the name of the mountain. The name of the mountain could possibly indicate 2 things. One thing it could indicate is a transfer of power because at the root of avarim is avar, like going that you're now going to be part of the past, and to have time to recognize that. So for me, I can barely imagine what Moshe might be experiencing during this last time period, and that he might really need significant time to assimilate this.
Yeah.
So that in terms of past, but also in terms of crossing over, the lavor tayaden kind of thing, because he will be doing a different kind of crossing over. He'll be crossing over to an entirely other world. So both of those are huge things.
Yes, beautiful. The mountain of transitions, mountain of crossings. That's such a profound name and feels so appropriate for what Moshe is doing. I think as I'm taking your point sort of in 2 ways. One, maybe it lends a little bit of credence to the Abarbanel's idea, whether we take it actually that Moshe went up there a number of times or not, that there's something, maybe I'm merging my 2 thoughts here in one, that there's something to the early exposure to the notion of the transitional place that gives Moshe an opportunity to start to acclimate to his transitions and to the different kind of crossing that he's going to make them, the people. So we could even maybe somehow read it spiritually, go up into this, high place, sublime place of transitions, and gain perspective from there. And then the time will come when you're gathered unto your people. I think really I'm sure that the Hasidic masters have capitalized on this, you amongst them, Bracha. So it's a beautiful reading. Thank you. Okay. Rev Scott?
So it occurred to me that Sefer Devarim is also known as the Mishnah Torah. And so much of what's already in Devarim is a repetition of what happened before. So why is this particular section singled out? It doesn't seem like it's that different from so many other sections, including Aseret HaDibrot, right? Even though there are differences. And it strikes me that, if Devarim is Moshe's final address to the people of Israel, and he's recounting everything that happened, that the repetition of this command is not so strange.
Yeah.
The other thing that strikes me is that Moshe demonstrates a certain understanding that he's not the right leader for bringing the people into the land. He's not the right leader to lead them in the conquest. And Yehoshua seems to be better equipped to do that. And this seems like the right time for transition to take place.
Yeah. Great thoughts. My initial thought about your first question is, I think I would agree 100% if we saw Moshe recount this in Devarim, if he said, and at that time, then God said to me, go up on Mount Avarim and see the land, even though you won't get to. But it seems like it's being narrated in real time, both here and there. That the end of Devarim is sort of after Moshe's speeches are complete, and then kind of the narrative resumes. And I think that's the basis for the repetition. But the underlying your question, I agree. There might be a way to suggest that this, that there sort of follows the general theme of Devarim recounting. And yes, I think I agree with you that Moshe has this sense, and already sort of has an awareness of Yehoshua, and that's something kind of very present in the text. Absolutely. Thank you. Dad?
Yes, I have two observations. One, if we go back to Aaron's death, Eliezer comes with him.
Yes.
And Moshe participates in the transfer of power. He undresses Aaron and dresses Eliezer. So he knows Aaron's not going to enter the land. Now Aaron will have a successor. So he must have in the back of his mind at that point, before our Parashah, that he's going to need a successor. So that's part of what drives him to ask the question. Who will this be? The other observation is Moshe is going to look at the land for however many days it is, and then in Hazino he'll get a final view. So just to make a connection, rose bushes, different kinds of rose bushes. One is called multiflora, which means there's a lot of little flowers. And another is called grandiflora. There are fewer flowers, but bigger ones. So Moshe, over this time period, is going to view the land from different perspectives, almost like Bilam viewing the children of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And he'll have different views, different places, and just see what it looks like. But it's a present view. I think what Moshe sees on the last day is a gift from God. He sees the future. He sees the tribes in their locations. He may even be gifted with seeing the Beit HaMikdash place. So that's the two different viewings that he has.
Beautiful. Really beautiful thoughts. So rich there at the comparison of the view from different perspectives to Bilam Balak's view from different perspectives is great. I'm going to share yeah, and just the literary, the midrashic expansiveness around Moshe's death is so profound, because I feel I mean, I can only speak for myself. I grieve every year about Moshe's death, and I kind of go through his anguish along with him. I mean, it's just so profound. You go through the year, the Torah reading year, and you live alongside Moshe's life and his journey. Incomparable though our lives may be to his. And so there's so much pathos around it at every step of the way. And I want to just share my screen again to note what you were, relating to what you were saying about the way Moshe experiences Aaron's death and what that brings up for him. So Rashi comments there when God tells Moshe, take Aaron and his son Elazar and bring them up on Hor Hahar, I should say, Mount Hor. Rashi says, where it says, take Aaron, this is always a problem, an exegetical problem. You can't take a person. If you take an object, you can't take a person, by and large. This is all the problem on Vayikach Korach. What did he take? How do you take? So usually when the Torah commands to take a person, the explanation given by the rabbi is often like kachem bidvarim, take them with words, bring somebody along with the power of words. So when it says take Aharon, the Midrash interprets take him by words. How do you bring someone to their death by words? You offer them gentle comfort. What is the comfort that Moshe is told to give Aaron? Is happy are you that you will see your crown being given to your son, something to which I am not privileged. Now, the idea that Moshe is supposed to say to Aaron, the something of which I am not privileged, is that a consolation? I have no idea. I don't know why does Moshe just add that on himself. I have no idea, but it's the consolation for Aaron, and it of course just points up the pain for Moshe. And I think it a little bit explains further 2 psukim later when it says Moshe did as God had commanded. Rashi says, although this thing was difficult for him, he did not delay to do so. I think difficult at 2 levels. Difficult to bear witness and be an escort to his brother's death because of what I believe was a true loving relationship between them, but also difficult because he bore witness to the death and successorship of children that he was not going to experience for himself. So there's just so much there that is oh yeah. And so whenever we see Moshe's death described to Moshe in comparison to Aaron's death, I think we are meant to understand both the comparison and the contrast. So that's just another dimension that's always present. Yeah.
Can I add another observation?
Please.
You mentioned about the pathos, the difficulty with Moshe's death. It's for many years it struck me that we read about Moshe's death in Zos HaBracha, which we read on Simchas Torah, and somehow his death doesn't get the attention it deserves. It's too joyous of an occasion, and there's no sense of mourning.
Yeah.
Except now, as of this year, Simchas Torah has a totally different feel.
Yes. Even Zion Adar, the day which is Moshe's yahrzeit, we're told, is also his birthday. So there's sort of this way in which, maybe the Chachamim intuit that it's just too overwhelming to confront Moshe's death, on an unvarnished sort of way. So they always couch it in other occasions. I don't know. It's and yet, comparing to Aaron's death, there are certain ways in which Aaron's death, brings more national grief than Moshe's. There's a lot to think about there. Yeah. Thank you. David L., please.
I want to ask a much more basic question, and that is the question whether Vayasef and mate are two different things. So if we look back in chapter 20, where you just were, at verse 26, right? It's talks about the dressing of Elazar and the Bibei Kahuna.
Yeah.
Yasef who made Sham. So if Yasef means he's going to die, Yasef then why would it would be redundant to say Umet? Similarly, and this is certainly not correct because otherwise Rav Samet would have said it, that maybe what we're talking about is Moshe becoming a lame duck, as it were, to continue our contemporary read. If we look back at the stories where the Vayesef El Amav is used previously in Breshit, they're all stories of individuals in families, not individuals in nations. So it's also sort of I don't know how to think about it yet, something to think about. But here, where it's not an individual, it's not just the individual's death, but it's the individual relinquishing their role. That in a sense, they're returning to be part of the populace and no longer being the leader.
And that, just to take that to the last step, that if I understand you correctly, that explains also the slight difference between the way it's presented in our parasha. Let's just, I'm going to share my screen so we can see that more clearly, right? When you're going to go up on Mount Avarim and view the land, when you have seen it, you'll be gathered to your people, just as your brother Aaron was. That means you'll sort of like relinquish your role at some level. And so now Moshe calls for a successor, and maybe the successor already begins some active involvement, as opposed to in Devarim, where the actual, command is given in the sort of ultimate sense. There it's umut bahar asher ata ola shama b'he'asef elamecha. So there's the he'asef elamecha is there, but mut is added there. And so there's sort of in addition to already the stepping back, is the actual death. I think that's a really, really interesting thing to consider, answer some of the challenges. And it's such a rich language. It bears its own kind of understanding. So it's great additional dimension to take with us as we read. Thank you. Yeah, Bracha.
I think it's interesting that both times it says Elamecha, because this was the most fraught time, where there was such a split between him and the people, that it's very reassuring, I would imagine, to him that in both cases it says you'll be gathered among your people. That kind of reconnection despite all of the problems.
Yeah, beautiful. Sometimes that's only possible posthumously in certain ways. The true kind of restoration to the people, because a leader, even in attempting to be for the people, is separate from the people and often at odds with the people, is a necessary part of their leadership in some way. And only when they relinquish their leadership in a certain way are they able to kind of be gathered back into their people, when that works out. Wow. Thank you, everybody. Such a rich conversation, and to Rav Samet for opening it up with his analysis. And we'll have Matot Maseh next week to conclude the Midbar and conclude this round of our Parsha learning together. So thanks to everybody. Love to mom and dad, and good night to all.